Hello and welcome. We're in my wormery today and we're checking in on my finishing tubs. These tubs have been in service now for 48 days. That's a fair amount of time if I had simply left these bins to let the worms that are still kind of stragglers or maybe newborns in the bins. If I had done nothing other than leave them, I have a feeling I might have some really nice finished compost at this time. But I've been doing various things. I've been trying to bait the worms out, which means I was trying to put little pockets of food in there, using boxes, and more recently just taking some melon and wrapping it in paper, trying to bait the worms out. And I'm starting to wonder if I'm shooting myself in the foot by doing that, instead of letting the worms really compost down the remaining food bits that are still in the finished compost, and then maybe trying to separate them out at the end. I'm wondering if I'm actually defeating my purpose by putting in larger quantities of food that the worms can actually go after. So I'm kind of switching gears again on these containers, and I've made the decision today to go in here and obviously if there's worms hanging out by the food that we added last week, which was a few chunks of cantaloupe melon wrapped up in newspaper, if there's worms hanging out there, I'll extract those worms and move them into another active bin of mine. But I think the decision I've made at this point, so this is like plan B or plan C at this point, is to just remove those large chunks of food and to really just let these bins wind down on their own, in the hopes that maybe any straggler worms or newly hatched worms in the bins kind of get to work on whatever little remaining food bits are in the bins in order to come up with some good finished compost in the end. So, yep, switching gears again and just bringing you along for the ride. So this is the first of the 3 bins, and as I try to poke down here a little bit where the melon, or at least the cantaloupe rinds were placed in this paper bag, it almost feels like the paper bag has been emptied out almost. So let's see what we end up with. My hope is that there's going to be a little mob of worms hanging out here, in addition to any leftover food that they've not yet completely nibbled away. And I think that that's really what we have here. There's a nice little collection of worms hanging out underneath the paper. I have to assume that within the paper, it doesn't feel like there's as many pieces of cantaloupe left in here as there were originally when we placed this into the container, when we placed it into the tub. But I have to assume that this is probably got a whole bunch of little worms hanging out inside. So let's see if we can fetch the last couple that we just spot here manually. If we can find a couple more. I'm going to assume that we didn't clear all the worms out of this bin. I'm going to assume that there's still going to be a few worms lingering within the material, so that when we put the tub back up on the shelf and let it rest for a little while longer, that the remaining worms actually do continue working down the remainder of the material. So all these little remaining chunks of leaves and stuff that are still in the bin, I'd really like to see the remaining worms kind of get to work on that remaining material and break it down nicely to give this bin a really nice finished appearance. Oh, here we got a nice little hunk of worms that came up when I lifted that pile of compost off the bottom of the bin. So here I'm not aiming to manually pick out every worm from the bin, but I figured if I encounter worms, I might as well go ahead and include them in the extraction process. And we're just going to place these little guys into some other active bin of mine. So whatever, we're going to leave the remaining worms that we find in the bin. Now we're just going to go ahead and put this bin back up on the shelf as is. And the hope is going to be that the worms continue to work down whatever material remains in here. All right, let's get this thing back up on the shelf and get the next bin out here. Okay, so now, once again, we've got ourselves some stuff that's really just going to be turned into worm chow. Some sprouts that we're going to include as food once we move this reclaimed food over into another active bin. So here again, it feels like the newspaper is kind of hollow, like the stuff inside's been eaten out of it. So I'm just going to scoop it up here to see what we see. Oh, wow, okay, so this really did manage to round up a fair number of worms. I would like to try to get them into this little container here without losing too many of them. Because this material is actually quite nicely broken down, and I don't know if it's going to require a great deal more time in terms of just letting the worms really finish it off. Because, like, as I've mentioned before, these are what I consider as finishing tubs, so I'm trying to really allow the material to reach sort of a more finished state before I actually bless it as completed vermicompost that's ready for use out in the garden. But there again, I guess having a few worms remain to do the remaining work is also part of the equation here. So let's not go too crazy trying to remove the worms. I'm just going to kind of treat this as another seemingly successful baiting attempt, because it does seem like we had a nice large number of worms, and I also have to assume that within the newspaper, huddled around the melon that's inside, that there's probably also a fair number of worms hanging out. So, all right, let's just cover this back up again. Not even covering it up, it's just kind of leveling it off from the third bin. These bins are all a little bit different in terms of the way they're progressing. I believe the one that we just looked at was the one that was most vigorously populated with worms. This one was, I was suspecting that this one might not have quite as many. I think that's clear too, just from looking at the bottom of this little bait bomb that we just removed. There might be worms inside the newspaper, who knows, but it doesn't seem like we saw as many here as we did in the other bins. I believe that's mainly attestable to the fact that when I harvested this material originally, it was the bin that I spent the most time on in order to separate the worms from the compost. And every time we look at this material, it seems to be fairly clear that there's just not nearly as many worms within the material. So, you know, kind of invested a little bit more time during the harvesting of the bin that this material was extracted from. I think it is kind of clear that there was much fewer worms in the material as a result of doing it that way. Okay, so now I just have to go grab one of my active bins off the shelf so that we can release whatever worms we just gathered. So let's put this back up on the shelf and choose an active bin that we can throw all the reclaimed worms and material into. Okay, so the bin that we have here on the table is actually my oldest bin, and this is the one that I've decided we're gonna drop everything into. So we're just gonna move everything in here aside so we can dump the entirety of it right into here and see how we fared. Just curious, can't wait to see. This is good because we're actually including some bedding material in the form of this newspaper by doing this. So it seems like we actually managed to bait a fair number of worms out of here. I can see as I'm opening up these pieces of paper, this one's got a nice big wad of worms in it. So does this one. I really don't see much remaining food, to tell you the truth. How about this one here? It felt like there was food in the paper, but I think what I was actually feeling was worms. Look at that. How do you like that? Pretty awesome. So I think this was actually the most successful baiting attempt so far, but alright, I'm going to put this all back on the shelf. It's pretty much what I was after today, so if you enjoyed the video, give it a quick thumbs up, and I appreciate you watching. Thanks for tuning in. Alright, have a great day. Bye now. Want to make sure I don't leave these little guys in the tray. Let's make sure we get them into the mix too. Now I think we've got everyone. All right, everyone, one more time. Thanks for watching. Bye.